Please hold. Connecting to host.
Suddenly blurted from the speakers in a strange agglomeration of broken digital voices, abruptly ending the awkwardly lengthy silence that had followed the video's odd intro logo. The video appeared to be a first-person perspective of someone watching an almost identical video to the one Daniel had moments before stumbled across and was currently watching. The audio sounded degraded and distant, but this alone could not account for the unsettling quality of the music that softly began to fade in after the initial announcement. The video's subject muffled a whimper and continued to stare at her screen, apparently frozen in shock. Daniel watched the mysterious video enthralled, his eyes eagerly drinking in every single pixel of his screen. He looked to the video's details. It had been uploaded minutes ago by a user he did not recognize. The same user that had uploaded the video on the protagonist's screen, which itself he could see had been uploaded earlier that day. The woman in the video, whose breathing had been gradually becoming more erratic, held her arms in front of her face and searched them. She then moved on to search the rest of her body. The video frame rate was low and inconsistent, whilst the audio remained constant and relatively clear, giving it the uncomfortable feel of observing something not quite human, as it behaves in an almost human manner. Daniel did not know what she was searching for, but she was notably relieved after a moment's search gave no results. She had just finished re-straightening her clothes when a bead of sweat rolled down the side of her nose, causing her to reflexively slap her hand to her face to catch it. Her hand was shaking as she slowly moved her finger downward, wiping it away. Her breathing had become short and sharp, and she was beginning to sweat quite profusely. Large drops of sweat ran down the creases of her face in waves, like rain pouring down a window in a thunderstorm. The woman leaped from her seat and started moving down what seemed to be the hallway of an average family home. The erratic nature of her movement, combined with the low frame rate of the video, allowed for Daniel to take note of the pictures on the walls. The pictures contained two happy children and their parents engaging in various group activities, and it was the mother in the pictures, he surmised, through whose eyes he was now watching as she frantically stumbled into the bathroom of her family home and looked into the mirror and began to cry. The music from her laptop, still perfectly audible, jumped into a maddening frenzy. Daniel was correct. It was indeed the woman from the pictures, but she was almost unrecognizable. Her face was bright red and dripping with sweat. Huge veins bulged from her skin, the result of which was to awkwardly distort the shape of her head. Still looking in the mirror, tears streaming down her terrified and contorted face, her nose began to bleed. Her hand instinctively darted up to her face to catch the blood, and she suddenly froze, her eyes wide open and looking at her arm. Daniel saw nothing, certainly nothing more shocking than her swollen, fevered head. The woman, arms still held up to the mirror, began to scream and plea. Then Daniel saw it, a small patch of gray skin down by her elbow. The music slowed to an offbeat crawl as frame by staggered frame, the gray patch spread to cover the woman. Her screams weakened and she began to violently convulse. Daniel winced as a motion-blurred close-up of the woman's bathroom counter was accompanied by the tooth-curling sound of a human mouth hitting a porcelain surface with great force, followed by darkness and silence. The deathly silence hung in the air, like an executioner's axe hangs above a victim's neck, until it was broken by the words,
Please hold. Connecting to host.
Suddenly blurting from his speakers in a strange agglomeration of broken digital voices, followed by the same disturbing music, softly beginning to fade in. A chill ran over Daniel's body. Clever, he said aloud to himself as he pretended not to glance at his arms in his peripherals. A click of his mouse revealed a gigantic archive of similar videos reaching back for at least a year. Daniel sat and thought for a moment, his eyes fixed upon the rows upon rows of screenshots of screens before him as the unsettling tune continued to play into the otherwise silent room. A bead of sweat rolled down Daniel's forehead. He smiled to himself as the music grew more intense, seemingly in response to his discovery of his perspiration. Daniel casually slid his hand up his face and across his shaven head, the sweat pooling at the edges of his hand. It was not uncommon for it to be almost unbearably hot in Daniel's bedroom, and had performed this maneuver multiple times this evening alone. But this time, as his hand reached the base of his skull, his body went rigid as reflexes wrenched his hand from his head, spraying the back of his neck with sweat. His body still stiff, Daniel slowly returned his hand to the back of his head and began to tentatively search for the small, soft, and painful lump that had startled him. He did not struggle to find it, as it had doubled in size and began to ache and throb. His finger gently prodded the lump, as Daniel gingerly attempted to understand what it was. He began to feel a faint, periodic brushing on the palm of his hand. The brushing grew stronger, then into a throbbing pressure against the underneath of his hand. It was another lump, growing and pulsing on the side of his profusely sweating head. He began frantically searching his scalp with both hands, finding lump after lump, swelling and beating in unison with his rapidly increasing heart rate. Daniel began to look around his room in a panic, his eyes desperately darting from random object to random object before once again falling on his computer and widening as a moment of clarity spread across his terror-stricken brain. He lunged for his mouse, yanking the cursor into position and slamming down his finger on the stop button with the desperation and instant feeling of relief experienced by a diver reaching the water's surface moments before drowning. But the music continued. The music rose to a sickening, familiar frenzy as Daniel leaped up from his desk in shock, his eyes unblinkingly fixed on his computer screen as he repeatedly flicked his computer's speakers on and off. But the music continued uninterrupted and undisturbed by motion of his head relative to what he had originally assumed was the music's source. Daniel screamed in agony as his body began to convulse.
Please hold. Connecting to host.